we're doing a wonderful thing today that several people helped set up. You're here in person to see this author, and then we're doing Zoom at the same time. So I'm delighted to say Gregg Hurwitz is with us today to talk about Dark Horse, his latest in the X series. So we can welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm so happy to be on the road again. This is my second event. I was in Houston last week, but it's good to see all your faces. It's nice to be back. As a novelist, it took me about 6 months to realize we were even in a pandemic, because I'm just home. I have Microsoft Word, plenty of booze, 3 Rhodesian Ridgebacks and a family I actually like. So I was like clueless, but then it hit the grind and it's been tough. So it's good to have events in person. It's life affirming, I think. So I've been thinking about with this book, it's the seventh Orphan X book, which is pretty cool. It's certainly the longest I've ever done in a series. I was inclined towards standalones. I had one series that went 4, and I was thinking about, it's puzzling even to me where I made a choice to start this series. If you think about it, here's Evan's story in chronological order, right? He was raised in an East Baltimore boys' home, pulled out at the age of 12 by Jack Johns, his handler and father figure, trained as an off-the-books assassin. And Jack told him the hard part isn't making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. Raised him under the 10 Commandments, which were centered around upholding hardcore operational perfection and keeping him devoid of the messiness of human interaction. Then he completed a bunch of missions as Orphan X, starting at the age of 19, operating in international spaces where the US is not allowed to go and neutralizing targets in violation of international law. One sec. Could somebody here mute maybe? I'm just getting a little bit of sound through here.
Okay.
Let's get everyone muted if we don't mind. Thank you so much. And so basically, he starts all this stuff. Then because his moral compass was always kept intact, he has a collision between himself and
3124 with tax.
Hang on one sec. I'm getting just a ton of feedback here. Maybe is it this?
Is there a mute all somewhere?
Well, we don't.
And then we have your receipt going to your text message.
Whoever is talking, will you please mute your phone?
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you. I think it was them right here. It wasn't, you guys are getting blamed for it, but it's all these awful people. I don't want to name names. Okay, so basically, he leaves the program then, right? He goes off the radar. He becomes the nowhere man. He makes this really weird choice to live not as a lone wolf, but among ordinary people. He's got this stark Scandinavian design, high security penthouse on the Wilshire corridor, floating above people in condos, ordinary people with ordinary concerns, which is a super odd choice for a man more comfortable garroting human smugglers in bathhouses than making small talk by the mail slots. And he begins his nowhere man missions, pro bono assassin for the truly desperate. And while he can never be normal, I always think of him as an outsider looking in through the glass at ordinary people leading ordinary lives that he himself can never have, but he can at least protect theirs. And then we arrive at where I decided to start the series, which is the first Orphan X book, where his past finally catches up to him, where he's forced to blow up all 10 commandments to find his very self-definition in flux as these lethal stakes push him towards a new version of himself. And we witness much more vividly in Orphan X the collision of the archetypal badassery that we're used to from our favorite characters, from Bond to Bourne to Reacher to Joe Pike, with the quotidian concerns and aggravations of having ordinary people around him, like the irritable Jewish lady who lives downstairs from him, who may or may not be based on my late grandmother. The unending HOA meetings where they're discussing like the carpet pile for the new carpet in the lobby of the, discussing all this stuff ad nauseum. So why did I start the series there? There's so much story that happened before. What a weird place to pick up the story of Orphan X mid-gallop. And what I realized is I don't always know why I write what I write until I already have, and I look back on it. One of my favorite quotations about writing is from Joan Didion, that great master of the thriller. No, not really. But she said, "I write so I know what I think." It's such an interesting way for me to think about that, is that a lot of times I don't always know consciously what's driving the creative process. And so I began this. And so one of the things I discovered that I think in hindsight is that the Orphan X series and the whole story of him is really a story of becoming. I began it as Evan Smoke is shattered out of his old worldview, when the commandments by which he's oriented himself all these years go out the window, when he finally cracks the door to having some version of human relationships with all their mess and complications. I've said a lot that he doesn't understand. He doesn't speak the strange language of human intimacy, but he's learning a little bit more about it in each book. And this mission forces him into a new kind of awareness more than any that have come before. His untraceable phone line, 1-855-2-NOWHERE, which you can all call, and there's a message waiting for you. When it rings this time, it heralds a mission of a very different kind. Adrenaline and anticipation converged into something dangerous and delicious, the start of a mission that could lead to Evan's death or another piece of his salvation. He took a breath, exhaled to calm, then said, "Do you need my help?" Evan's question had rarely been answered with a question. Do you help anybody who needs your help? If they're worthy. I don't know then. What? If you'll find me worthy. An unusual start, unlike any preceding mission. Evan let the man breathe. He sounded troubled, a faint kiss of an Hispanic accent, a formality to the cadence of his words, unrushed, composed, a man accustomed to being listened to. So that's what you do, the man asked. You help people outside the law, people no one else is willing to help. Yes. What do you want for it? Nothing. A note of incredulity. Nothing? No money, no credit, and no permission. A long silence. Then the man said, "A man who needs none of those things can move the world." "What is your name?" "Aragon Urea. Perhaps you have heard of me." "I have not." A very long silence. "I have heard of you, the nowhere man." Evan asked carefully, "Why do you think I would have heard of you?" "I'm not a good man, and now God has punished me." "How have you been punished?" "My daughter has been taken by my enemy." "Who is your enemy?" "Cartel." Aragon breathed. "My competitors." "Your cartel?" Evan said, "and you're calling me?" "I'm not cartel. I'm an unconventional businessman." "Assume I've already heard every version of that argument," Evan said, "so we can skip this part. You know who I am, so I'll ask you again. Why are you calling me?" "Do you know of La Familia Leones?" Evan did. He gave the revelation the respect it deserved. The Leones had muscled in on the Zetas in Nuevo Leon, one of the Mexican states floating below the border of South Texas, and they had affiliate franchises starting to metastasize throughout the American Southwest. There's only one way to take on the Zetas, the most vicious cartel in the world: to be more vicious, inspire more fear, project more terror. Stories had spread, some apocryphal, some not, a catalog of horrors. Mass graves in the desert, desiccated limbs sprouting from the sand like gnarled roots. An orchard of 55-gallon oil drums sprouting in an abandoned salvage yard, each one plugged with a concrete encased corpse. Journalists mummified in duct tape, left to bake to death in the trunks of abandoned cars, the metal dented from their feet and heads. Ex-girlfriends found stiff and eyeless in alleys, the Leonis gang sign carved between their shoulder blades with butcher knives. "I've heard of them," Evan said. "These savages," Aragon said, "they obey no rules. My 18-year-old daughter is in their hands. She's a beautiful girl. She's pure of heart. She's untainted by who I am and what I have done. She is good. She is as good as I am not, and they have her." The pain in his voice was tangible, a deep ache thrumming beneath the surface of the words. "You asked if I need your help," he said. "I do. I need your help. Will you help me?" Evan heard the faintest sound, like broom whiskers brushing dryly across a floor, the sound of Aragon Urea weeping. Evan ran his thumb across his hairline, freeing beads of sweat. Gently, he said, "I don't know," and disconnected the line. This is the first time that Evan's client is somebody who, under ordinary circumstances, he would assassinate. Aragon Urea, a man nearly broken with grief, is as dark and complicated as Evan himself. He's Cartel 2.0. He's Netflix to Blockbuster, running an enormous drug operation that skirts international law. But he's also a beloved patron to his town in South Texas, providing money for good roads and schools, businesses, and care for the elderly. And later in the novel, he even makes an argument that he's just as much a free market capitalist as the big pharma drug companies, but that he actually does more for his community than they do. And he also provides his own brand of rough justice for the community, not unlike the justice that Evan carries out himself. And now in Dark Horse, his 18-year-old daughter has been kidnapped by a rival cartel leader, a psychopath who goes by El Moreno, or the Dark Man. She's an innocent being punished for the sins of her father. And Evan has to decide whether he can ignore Aragon, the drug runner, and help Aragon, the father, this man who holds up a dark reflection of Evan himself. It's certainly the most morally complex story I've written, in which Evan has to ask himself, can a bad man be saved? It's a question he's asked himself every day since he left the orphan program. So perhaps in doing this mission for Aragon, he can not only save an innocent girl, but find a different understanding of himself. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Without giving anything away, because there are a lot of twists in the story, when you began.
Did I know the end when I began? I knew the shape of it. I mean, one of the ways that I describe writing is, you know, those indoor rock climbing walls, and they have the different kind of handholds and footholds. I can start a story when I know that there's enough of them to get me across the wall from beginning to end. So I know there's like a big chunky scene, let's say in the third act at the end, but I don't know if I'm going to get there with my left hand or my right foot, you know? And so I had a shape of it, but I always leave the story room to breathe and grow and develop, because I discover things in the writing of them. And so I had a sense of it. I certainly knew where I was headed, but things filled out, and, the battle plan never survives first contact with the enemy. Any other questions? Yes.
Can I ask a question about Evan Smoke himself?
I can ask any question that you'd like.
Okay. Question is Ryan Gosling's going to play the Gray Man in the movie coming up. Who would you want as an actor to play Evan Smoke?
Who would I want as an actor to play Evan Smoke? It's always such a hard question to answer, because, I have a sense of him. I see him so specifically, but I don't see his specific features, right? So it's a weird, a lot of authors have talked about that there's this very specific sense. He's based on me in a lot of ways. I'm average size, average build. My wife is tiny. I always joke she's like my pocket wife, and her feet are like size 5.5. So it's like, it's amazing that they can actually hold her upright without her just falling over. And I can go into any store and get anything off the rack. I'm size 10.5 shoe. I'm dead average. And so I designed Evan in a lot of ways after me. There's a line I have in every book that I say, ordinary size, ordinary build, just an average guy, not too handsome, is how I describe him, which is quite a striking difference from James Bond, who of course is devastatingly handsome, or Jack Reacher, who's 6'5" when he's not busy being Tom Cruise. And the new series is wonderful. And I actually like Tom Cruise's depiction of him too, in terms of the intensity, but it's nice to see that physicality and bearing on screen. And so it's interesting in that it's got to be somebody who isn't too handsome, who isn't too much of a presence. I think it'll be someone discovered. I sold the rights to the book a year before it came out. I only sent it to Bradley Cooper. And it's because I wanted the range of his talent from Silver Linings Playbook to American Sniper, but I lost him to A Star Is Born. And so I have the rights back, and I'm kind of waiting to see who that will be. And my sense is it will probably be somebody who is new in a way that's surprising. The way that, like in Breaking Bad, when they cast that out, it was like a very shocking choice for the Brian, his name's escaping me. Cranston, right. I mean, I have a feeling it's going to be somebody who we're interpreting in a different way, who can kind of disappear, but then can have a real focused intensity. Gosling would have been interesting. Bradley would have been great, but I would have had to cross out the not too handsome part, of course, with either of them. Almost somebody like James McAvoy from 10 years ago, who's just sort of interesting. He's ordinary looking, but he's handsome. And then he can really put forward a lot of intensity when the occasion calls for it. So we'll wait and see. I'm waiting now for just the most interesting creative partner before I'll readdress it. Yes.
The covers on the book, do you have anything to do with that? And do you know why there's a difference between our covers here and like in Britain or other countries? They're all different.
So do I have anything to do with the covers? Yes, I have cover approval, which is nice. Everybody jokes that it's me on the covers. Look, is that me? It's a tougher version of me. But yeah, no, I have, approval. We go back and forth. They do a great job for me at Minotaur. And so it's not an onerous process at all. I remember some of my early books, I got some covers that were just horrible. But they're great. And we have a flow about what that looks like. And look, covers work very differently in different territories. It's very interesting. I mean, the other covers I'm involved with most heavily is England, is the UK, and then, Ireland, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the submarkets there. And those have sort of a different tenor to them. There's just different marketing works in different places. I don't have much to say about, I'm in, I believe, 33 languages. A lot of the other ones I just shrug, go, okay, if that's what's working there, I get them. If something's really awful, I'll weigh in on it. But each place has just different marketing. As you know, like when you travel, there's different kinds of billboards and TV commercials and branding on products. It's weird. Everything's got their own cadence, Yes,
I have
ma'am.
a question.
Is there going to be another sequel to this without giving away this one?
Will
And if so, how long do we have to wait for it?
there will be a sequel to this or another one in the series. It'll be out 1 year from this week. So that's as fast as I can type. Luminita, is that you there?
Yeah, hi. When I finished the previous book, I think it was called Prodigal Son, I was sure that was it. It sounded like you're not continuing, and I was so mourning. And all of a sudden, you have a new one. Were you at one point thinking of cutting it off there? Because you said something in an interview about your mom being upset that that you're not going to have another book with the Orphan X.
So she's asking, the last book ended, and that could very well have been the end of it, right? He was ejected out of the building like Moriarty going over the falls. I always had a plan for him to be back.
Okay.
It was my secret plan. I just like upsetting my mother.
Good, because he was so sad, and I so didn't want him to leave the warehouse. It's such a beautiful place. I'm an architect, so for me, the design of that warehouse was an ideal place to live. So I'm glad
Oh,
that
thank
he's
you. Thank
restoring
you.
it.
The design of his penthouse where he lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of that was,
it's
it's designed in some ways, as a reflection. Everything in there is a reflection of his personality, right? It's very cold, kind of Scandinavian, poured concrete, stainless steel, everything can be polished to a high shine.
minimalist.
It's also why he drinks vodka. Unlike me, I prefer bourbon, though I'm happy to drink vodka. I get sent a lot of vodka now from companies around the world for research purposes, much of which I don't remember. But because vodka is the purest liquid, right? So it's everything around him is purification, and it's such a contrast for him when he goes out into the dirtiness and the filth of the world and these missions, but also when he's downstairs at Mia's place, all the life, right? She's got like candles and throw pillows, and there's crayon mashed in the carpet. And so some of the mess that comes in around it, that comes around intimacy, because people are messy and relationships are complicated. And he's, you can't hold your environment in perfect place, right? If you engage in that. So his surroundings are very much a reflection of him. And yet he's got this longing to be around and near people who reflect different parts of the human experience that he's holds at arm's distance, but has some longing for. So
like everybody wants what they don't have.
yes,
So
that's
that
right.
ideal penthouse. Thank you for
Yes,
bringing it back.
You're welcome. Anna, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I just wanted to ask, how did you decide on the original 10 commandments? Actually, I used one of them for my senior quote last year because it just really resonated with me, but I wanted to ask how you came up with them.
Thank you. Did you use the second commandment?
I used the how you do everything, or sorry, how you do anything is how you do everything.
The second commandment. Yeah, a lot of people have tattoos of that too. So maybe that'll come once you graduate. Oh no, I'm just kidding. What's really interesting is this is another thing of the creative process, kind of getting out ahead of myself a little bit. But the first commandment is assume nothing. Second commandment is how you do anything is how you do everything. Second commandment probably is the most popular. A lot of that is tied into his OCD, right? OCD is basically operational perfection taken to excess, right? Like, and there's times where he's like trying to clean every surface, and you can get stuck. It's almost like a glitch in the hardware. But it's also very important in terms of Zen-like focus, right? If he's dealing with life and death stakes, everything is perfection. When you're habit building in anything, in any job, in a relationship, like we have to be conscious all the time of little shortcuts that we take in our minds, like little instances of laziness, or maybe, where we're not lying, but we're kind of dodging the truth from ourselves and others. And there's a sort of, there's a lot of development and advancement that we can get in purity if we're really checking and watching our motives and our actions. And that's something I've always strived to do, unsuccessfully, because I'm a flawed human, as we all are. But it's interesting because assume nothing in a lot of ways is an ability to not get weighed down in assumptions, in ideology, right? Getting captured by one view, whether it's political, whether it's cultural, whether it's a dynamic in a relationship, whether you're stuck in a rut somewhere. It's to try and approach and see everything for the first time, to try not bring all of your experience to every moment so that you're fully present in it. So it's got this very Zen-like state of being very open. So the first thing is that you pay attention to what's happening, right? You assume nothing, you take everything in, and then you proceed with as much care as you can possibly. And so they all just sort of filled out on their own. And then as I got further along in the books, I realized that there's a sort of internal logic to how I ordered them. But at the time I was just kind of filling them in. So it's funny. And I didn't do them in order, right? I had like gaps in the first two books. I was like, I got to figure out a third commandment, right? And then it just sort of worked out in this way that had order. And I find that happens a lot. I'm sure some of you have noticed this in your own life. Is like, if you follow that instinct, if you follow your creative instinct, for me, it's always like, I think in some ways the illuminating force in my life tends to be curiosity. Like what kindles my curiosity, and what, when I start to explore more, moves me towards passion or towards greater interest. And if you follow that, it doesn't seem to make any sort of sense. And then often you get to the end and you look back and there's like a perfect pattern that brought you to where you are, if you're pure about paying attention to it. And that process also held for me with the 10 Commandments. So you're a senior, you're graduating?
I graduated last year. I'm in first year university right now.
Congratulations. Where are you university?
Thank you. I'm at Guelph Humber in Toronto, Canada.
Oh, good for you. Well, congratulations. I'm glad I could be part of your senior quote. That's quite an
Well,
honor.
I mean, I've been a fan since early 2017. It's my favorite series, like by far.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Anna. Thank you. Of
Well, thank you for writing them. They're amazing.
course. Does anyone else have something to say as nice as Anna did? Okay, you.
I have a question about the preamble you talked about where the book began. What I'm interested in where did Evan Smoke and his whole thing come out of your subconscious? And at what point did you say, who is this guy? What's he doing?
Okay, so he's asking where Evan came out of me in some ways. Again, another thing that happens in hindsight, I was scared to start the series. I'd written a series before, just 4 books, the Tim Rackley series. I'd done a lot of Hitchcock everyman standalone thrillers, a lot of which I think you guys have or are familiar with. And I wanted to do a series, but I wanted to get it right. It's like look, there's so many good series out there. I mean, from Sue Grafton to Robert Grace to Mike Conley to Lee Child to James Bond to Jason Bourne. And I wanted to really make sure I had something new to say. I didn't want it to be like, oh, it's another former Spec Ops guy who solves cases. And so I kept putting it off. And I wrote another book first. I think I wrote like 5 books almost. And I just had it percolating in the background. And where I knew I had a series was when 3 things kind of dropped in the line. One of them was I wanted there to be a lot of different channels for plots to arrive to me and to my character, having come from standalones. What I love about standalones is the question of motive is up for grabs, right? So if you're writing a cop or a PI or a FBI agent series, it's like, why did you take the case? Why did she take the case? It was her job, right? And I love in standalones, like, it's because of curiosity, right? Is it because envy? Like, what are the reasons why an adventure finds somebody? And so I wanted to have a lot of options open. And the setup of Orphan X, it's like I have the mythology episodes. If you think about like the X-Files had the mythology episodes and the standalones, right? The program, his past catches up to him. There's other orphans. The government comes after him. Then I had the 1855 to nowhere. The phone can ring and it's a new mission. Then I have personal stories, right? Like Prodigal Son. He picks up the phone. Evan, it's your mother. He never knew he had a mother. Is it really his mother? And then the people around him in Castle Heights, right? The people he's been exposed to. So I had all these tributaries that could feed in that for me could generate enough stories from enough angles that I felt like I could keep it fresh. The other thing was when I realized that, you know, the trope of a child trained to be an assassin is a not uncommon one, right? Whether it's Black Widow in Marvel, whether it's David Morrell, right? It's something we've seen, La Femme Nikita. And I thought, what if Evan being taken out of that East Baltimore foster home at the age of 12 was awful and traumatic in the ways that we know? But what if it also was the best thing that ever happened to him? Like, what if his handler loved him and Jack loved him? Jack was the first person to treat him like a human being. And he put him in the world. He trained him in foreign language. He trained him in history. He trained him in international etiquette. And so what I love about Evan the most, in some ways, is he's kind of like a blue collar Renaissance man. You know, he's got all the learning without the pretension. And I feel like that's something that we've gotten a bit into a world where I'm going to say the elites, and I mean that in the vague sense, but without all the political freightage that comes with it. But just so you know what I mean, you know, I went to fancy schools. I did a lot of that. And there seems to be some disconnect between that and real world applicability. And the people who I admire the most straddle those two things. Like, they know when they're engaged in the world of learning, in philosophy and art, they know a lot of that, but it's about application. And everything Evan does has to be applied to the world. And so when I had that moment, the moment of Jack, you know, the line for me around which the series coalesces is, the hard part isn't making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And that's his Achilles tendon, right? If he was just a true believer, if he was raised to be like Van Sciver, life would be easier. It's easier to be in a camp. It's easier to have all of your political affiliations and decisions decided for you in advance, right? It's easy to know your whole worldview and just lock it down and never change. And he doesn't belong anywhere, and he never will. He's always an outsider. And part of that is because he was raised not to be a true believer. He's raised to assume nothing, and he's raised to progress always in the care and the service of what is actually happening before him. And so that's a big challenge, but it keeps him alive and growing, you know, roughly in concert with me. And I'd say the third thing for me when I knew I had a series that would be fun and interesting for me was that notion of taking an archetypal character, right? Like Orphan X should be directed by Clint Eastwood, but he lives in the real world where you and I live. And that was the thing, is like, he still comes back and deals with ordinary people. He's bleeding from a knife cut and all of a sudden gets cornered by, you know, somebody, you know, the woman who's heavy on Laura Lee, who's like full of collagen and breast implants, who needs to talk to him about how, you know, she's got a kink in her neck because her day's been so stressful, right? And he's just been in like a stronghold by 4, you know, members of the cartel. And that interplay between the worlds as a means, I thought, we haven't seen that before. We don't see James Bond go home. We don't see Jason Bourne have to, like when Joey says she has to go to Target to go shopping because she needs feminine products. And he's like, oh my God, you know, so he's in all these circumstances that have to do with the real world. And that's what kind of cracks him into humanity. And that for me is where I realized that there was enough kind of fingers in. And then there's this, you know, there's Vera 3 right now, you know, his plant, there's the penthouse, there's his floating bed, there's the vodkas, his obsession with vodkas, all of which reflect around him. And I realized that I'd waited enough in my trepidation to start the series to have this whole sort of world and universe evolve around him, where I could do something new that wouldn't feel like a Jack Reacher knockoff, right? Or a Elvis Cole, you know, variation. It was really its own thing coming from me in my voice based on my interests and what I would need to continue to stay engaged. Because if I'm bored writing it, you'll be bored reading it. Yes, ma'am.
So would you say this is a story of redemption or survival for him? I mean, is he actually trying to redeem himself through these, or survive? Is he like Reacher, who just survives? You know, you don't necessarily always feel like he's, you know, trying to redeem himself. And if so, when you started the series, did you know what would redeem him, or how he would redeem?
So she asked if it's a story of survival or redemption, and if I knew what would redeem Evan in advance. Look, I think the missions in some ways for sure are each piece is like him getting a tiny piece of his soul back, right? But it's not that simple. Like he's not going to be redeemed. He wants to have missions where basically, you know, I say he's got unlimited resources in the bank. He's got a highly unusual set of skills and a lot of time on his hand. Like he's not going to open a dry cleaning shop, you know? So he needs to use his skills, and he knows that. And in some ways, the next book after this is going to get into this more. What's the ultimate good that is concrete and grounded? It's not ideology. Redemption's too highfalutin a word for him, right? But he knows he can bring his skills and that moral compass and his bearing that was inculcated in him by Jack. I think it's about trying to reduce human suffering on an individual level, that's the only absolute good that you can have in the world, right? It's not big and ideological and theoretical. And I think these missions are about getting a little piece of that back, but it's more complicated than redemption. It's really about growth, right? And it's funny, you know, I didn't think about this, of course, because what do I know? But I was writing this book right around when I turned 40. And, you know, 40 is a big age in a lot of ways, you know, because in some ways, I mean, if we're fortunate, it marks something around the midpoint. But I think it's also the age in which, for me at least, like any notion that of like, I didn't want to repeat sort of the striving young man archetype of the first half of my life over again. Like it becomes very clear that you're now at a point that you have to try to figure out a different avenue and awareness for yourself and your skills and your place in the world and what constitutes value and meaning, right? And I think we don't have a lot of voices around that. We're such a youth obsessed culture in so many ways, right? There's not a lot of stories and narrative and leaders who talk about these transitions that we have in terms of meaning and how we find it. In a lot of ways, I think the biggest point of this mission is it's the story of somebody searching to become more human, right? And to figure out even better what and how to deal with intimacy in relationships, which we all strive for, right? We all bring every complication we've ever had in past relationships to the present and to new relationships. There's a million new ways to screw up, right? And there's a million new ways to do stuff better every day. How you do anything is how you do everything. And so a lot of ways it's a search for him becoming human, and it's a search to maintain himself in a place with continuing meaning, given his realization that the old strictures and rules that govern the first half of his life were insufficient to carry him into the second half of his life. Yes.
You mentioned your curiosity, and I enjoy reading all the different, like the tech that was in Carnival and all the different things are, and just the different locations you'll use. I enjoy the art, Southern California, diversity of whether cultural neighborhoods or places. Are you willing to share your curiosity of what you like to research right now? Whether it's tech or...
Well, I don't want to give it away because she's asking about my curiosity and what interests me. You know, it's funny. I will say this, you know, I'm very interested in technology, and it started out, you know, when I was younger, it was more like, oh, here's cool technology to track people or hurt people or what's out of a DARPA lab. I mean, I do like that stuff, you know, and I'm always looking at what's like 5 to 10 years in the future and what's coming. And more, I'm very interested in the ways that technology and where the world is taking us, what the impacts are going to be for us psychologically and emotionally. Like, where is technology taking us off our actual evolutionary and genetic design, right? And so these new technologies that are, it's like they provide ample opportunities for mayhem. But you'll know in Prodigal Son, where I write about micro drones and them having, you know, these sort of outsourced conscience, right, that can be produced in ones and zeros. We're very close to having AI that can make the decision to execute people without a human in the loop, because it spares humans of PTSD and the trauma of it. But guess what? We're built for trauma and we're built for PTSD. We're built for suffering. And if we don't bear that cost, if there's no cost to that, then what happens, right? It's so one-sided. And part of what Evan's realization is that, like, the willingness that he has to carry the pain and the feelings of inhumanity in what he does is why he can take the responsibility for it. He's not after power. He's not after influence. He's after shouldering more responsibility, right? And in the responsibility, there's always pain and complication, and there's always suffering. There's always human suffering. And suffering, I think, in a lot of ways, is where we find our destiny. Suffer, the Greeks, it's a tale as old as the Greeks, right? Suffering is wisdom. And you read it when you're in high school and you're like, yeah, great. Like, let me avoid as much of that shit as possible. That's my one goal. But as we grow up, some of us, and things are visited upon us that are hard, it's very clear. You see it all the time. Like, it's easy to cave into it. It's easy to cave into bitterness and resentment. And the people I admire the most are people who have a very difficult situation and they figure out how to embrace that and how to learn from that. And it's the only answer for how you can possibly transcend it, right? If you take a horrible situation and instead of complaining, why me, you think, how do I make this the least terrible as possible? How do I find anything in this that could be beautiful or meaningful? And so, that's the stuff that interests me more and more, rather than, I remember in the Kill Clause, my fourth book, I talked about this new stuff called GPS, that was global positioning satellites in cell phones, and they can track your location from phones. And I remember, like, the HarperCollins PR department was like, that's so scary. Like, can they really? And it's of course is so shorthand for us. It's such a dated notion. And I'm less interested now in what that tech is than how it affects us, right? Like, how is that going to involve us? What does that take from us? What is luxury costing us, right? So I'm geared more towards that. And I find more and more I like writing. I still love writing the action, right, and the violence. But I appreciate more in some ways the suspense and the humor and all the stuff that involves his own personal, like how Orphan X handles a situation is different from how James Bond would or Jack Reacher would. And I really like the scenes that are more emotional and interpersonal, and I'm drawn more and more to those, right? And sometimes, so it's weird how what my kind of focus is. This chapters I can't wait to get to. It's also changing in a lot of ways. And at the end of the day, everything's about character. Everything is, not everyone can say, here's my favorite James Bond action scene. Everyone knows how he takes his vodka, And so I want to make sure that there's character in every aspect of the books, in every exchange, in every action sequence, in every interaction. Yes.
So to follow on that, I was wondering if, as you've written more and more of the books, does it become harder to write them? Because you have, all those goals, all those wonderful characters, all the vulnerability, all the action, does it become harder or easier because you know the characters better? Or the same?
Asking if the books get harder or easier to write. They get harder for me. It's funny. I used to like head down, blast through a rough draft, go back and edit. And more I write kind of forwards and backwards. There's a lot more thinking in between it. I think there's a different sort of, I'd like to think there's a different sort of depth in the books. And so, like, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was on a plane from Houston, wrote a scene. I had a bunch of notes and, I got all the stuff in, then I get home, I go to sleep and I'm like, wait a minute, like, what's the character stuff? Like, where's the humor? How do I bottom it out? How do I add more things happening? Like, how do I just deepen this out? And so it's slower going in some ways. I mean, now and then I can drop into the zone and just go like I used to. I also have a lot more things now. I had a movie come out a few months ago called Sweet Girl starring Jason Momoa. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have, I just launched a new comic, creator-owned comic with a new company. I'm doing a lot of pro bono work. One of my interests is in working against polarization, right? We're talking about ideologies and the ways people kind of dehumanize people with different sets of views. And so there's a lot more happening too. I no longer have the schedule that I was kind of just a novelist. I have TV projects, but the books for me and fiction and the novels, they've always been the spine of my career. They've always been my first love. And if I'm not doing it, I always feel like I'm not really working, which is funny. My wife will yell at me where I'm like, I didn't get any work done today. She's like, you had 8 Zoom calls and like rewrote a script. And it's like, it's not work. It's the books, the books are the thing for me. And so, but it feels like it's harder is a weird word. It feels like it gets more challenging. Maybe that's the word I would use. Yes.
How did you decide to add Joey into the series, and where did the inspiration?
How did I decide to add Joey into the series? Where did the inspiration come from? So Josephine Morales, Hellbent, she's introduced. It's the third book. She was supposed to die at the end of the book. That was in the outline. And the structure of Hellbent is sort of like Evan loses his father figure, and Jack's last mission for him in some ways is to push him to become a version of a father figure in his own right. So Joey comes in, she's a loudmouth, irreverent, brilliant, Hispanic, little punk rock, badass, brilliant hacker who's a washout from the orphan program. And she's the last thing Evan wants. Evan wants to go on a clean mission of revenge, like a Tommy Lee Jones movie from the 70s, right? And he stuck with her. And she was so vivid to me. She wrote so well who she was and what she pushed Evan on and brought out in him and how she presented herself. It was invaluable, that kind of contrast. And I couldn't do it. I got to the scene. If you go back and look at Hellbent, you'll know right the scene that she was supposed to die. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And then I tried to hide her in Switzerland and like get her away. And she came back. Like, I can't get rid of her. In a lot of ways, initially it was sort of like, is it Evan, Mia, who are kind of the principals? Candy has come back around, Orphan V. Tommy certainly is a key player in these books. But in a lot of ways, I think Joey is the number two. And it's just bizarre. I mean, if you told me when I was writing Orphan X and The Nowhere Man that the number two, the second on the call sheet for the series would be a 16-year-old hacker, I just wouldn't have ever thought it. But, she's a big link. And in some ways, like, she's his person and he's her person. There's a line I use where he says, like, he knew that some piece of her belonged to him and some piece of him belonged to her. And I think that's the only relationship that would be safe. If it was an intimate, like, somebody else, of course, but an intimate, physical, sexual relationship, like with Mia, it's too close. Like, he doesn't know how to navigate that the way he was raised. But with Joey, he's got this, strong, he calls him his uncle person. It's a very avuncular thing. And there's a purity in her that just calls out all the best parts of him. And she's funny as hell. I mean, she's funnier than I am in real time when I'm writing her on the page, so she's just a delight to write. Yes, sir.
The dog in the series, is he from your Rhodesian Ridgebacks?
So Dog the dog, yes, indeed. I have Rhodesian Ridgebacks. I right now have 3. My oldest boy, we just put down, and then I got I have big boys. So my oldest boy was Simba. I have Cairo, who's now a tripod. He lost his front leg to cancer. He's a big old badass. He's 125 pounds. I named him after the dog who parachuted in with SEAL Team 6 when they got Bin Laden. So he's Cairo. And then I have a boy called Zuma. They all have African names because of Rhodesian Ridgebacks, of course, Zimbabwe. And he's about 115 pounds. He's a puppy. He's a year and almost 2 years now. And my wife was tired of having these dogs who outweigh her and they won't get out of her way. She's got to like knee her way through them. And she wanted like a little small dog. So yes, Dog the dog, who's a Ridgeback. Absolutely. Like they're the breed in my heart. And my young adult series, The Reigns and Last Chance, one of the characters raises Ridgebacks, and Evan's childhood dog was a Ridgeback. And I wrote another book called You're Next. No, The Survivor. There's a Ridgeback in that. So they're my drug of choice for canines. But so my wife wanted a little dog, and she kept looking at these little shitty breeds that we were like, oh, my daughter and I were like, we can't do it, And so she said we were breed shaming her because we're like, oh, I heard those dogs are high strung and they yip all the time. I heard those dogs pee. Like, we just kept shaming her. So finally she said, look, we have a breeder who we love. She's got a big, huge ranch. They all just like run free with horses and eat fresh chicken eggs. And she said, why don't you call and see if there's like a tiny female? So tiny female for a Ridgeback is going to be 70 pounds. So I called up my breeder who I love. I said, what do you have? She said, we just got this new breed. They're all spoken for. And by the way, Zuma was from the Orphan X breed. They're all named after Orphan X characters. And he was Evan Smoke. So he's Zuma Evan Smoke Hurwitz. So they all have different names. And this breed was a Peanuts breed, which is my wife's favorite, that's her favorite entertainment, right? Narrative ever is that and Snoopy. And so there was this little baby called Peppermint Patty who was tiny, and she was so small that she hadn't been sold. All the other dogs had been bought. And I was like, oh, I don't want a female. I've never had a female dog. You know, I only want boys. I always want the biggest boy in the litter. But I was like, fine, I'll do this for my wife. And I asked my breeder, I said, tell me about the girl dogs. Because females and males of different breeds have different problems, right? Sometimes females are a pain. Sometimes the boys are too aggressive. I said, what are the girl Ridgebacks like? She said, well, they're way smarter. They know everything that happens in the house all the time. And they're super emotionally attuned. They're just better. She said, they're girls. They're females, you know? And I was like, oh, okay, well, we'll get this little shitty dog, you know, it's going to show up. And this dog has broken me. She's tiny. She's so cute. All my dogs I have trained like sit, stay on none of the furniture. She's like in bed with me in the morning, like under the sheets. Like she's totally, and of course, and it never occurred to me, but it's, you know, we have different relationships with women, with girls, with boys, with men. It's like, it's another mammal that's gendered. Like, of course I'm going to have a totally different relationship with her. It just never occurred to me. Do you have female dogs? They're just great. They're wonderful. And I only had the males. So anyways, yeah, we're Ridgeback fanatics, you know, so my day starts and ends with them. And, you know, Dog the dog is in there, and that's Joey's companion, even though she pretends she doesn't like him and she can't name him, but that's where it is. Yes.
So do you ever listen to the completed book on Audible with Scott Brick?
Scott Brick and I are very close. I actually had Scott read at my launch event up at Diesel Books in LA. He's always there every year. And I thought, you know what? No one needs to hear me read. I do the best I can, but you know, Scott Brick, I'll be at the event and he'll be talking and everyone's just looking because he's got this like the dulcet honeyed tones. He's incredible. And so, yeah, I never used to, but I'll listen. You know, I dip in and out. I'll grab scenes. I love how he does Tommy. He does a great job. And so the audiobooks, you know, I was the first person I think ever to put in my contract. It's got to be Scott Brick. I have, when I switch audio publishers, I said, I'm only going if it's Scott Brick. You know, Scott was with the book before I had editors on it. I wrote the rough draft of the manuscript. I wrote it on spec, even though I had multi-book deals, but I wanted to make sure I brought it to the right publisher, that everyone was on board. And what's funny is I stayed with my same editor, my same team, but just in case everyone didn't love it, I wanted to wind up somewhere that did. And I called Scott up and I said, look, I got this 1855 to nowhere thing. Here's the plot. Here's the thing. Can I come over? Can you just record the voice on the other end of that message? And so I went over with this manuscript before we even took it out to sell, because when editors were reading it, I wanted them to be able to call the number. And so people call and it's the voice of Evan Smoke goes, do you need my help? How did you get this number? And so Scott's been around with me from the beginning. It's a wonderful partnership.
He's great. Sometimes I'm not sure what I want to listen to. I look for what books he's voice.
It's an art form, you know, because if they're too theatrical, it's like, it's so weird. It's like, it's almost like when you see a play on stage, it's like you want it to be not theatrical, but it has to kind of intimate reality. So when he does women's voices, he doesn't go over the top with it. When he does, it's very easy. Like, you know, there's a lot of Hispanic characters, Latino characters in this. Very easy to get like stereotypical, right? Or to screw up, or, you know, he voiced Shep, was one of my characters from a book called You're Next, who's partially deaf. Yeah. It's very easy to sort of lean into a stereotype versus to very subtly kind of intimate the differences in voices. So I think of Scott like he's the conductor and all the parts of the orchestra. Any other questions? Yes.
A couple of tangential short stories that kind of highlighted different people, different aspects of the whole Orphan X series. A little more.
Short stories? There probably will be more short stories. I enjoy writing them. It just comes down to, you know, carving out enough space in my brain. Yes.
You've dealt with all of the characters that you've introduced him to that are making him a little more human. Mm-hmm. But you haven't mentioned the little boy.
Peter.
And he's getting to it.
Yeah, so Evan has a relationship with Mia downstairs, right? Single woman, district attorney. They have a don't ask, don't tell relationship. If she ever knew what he did for a living, she'd have to arrest him and put him in jail. And she's got an 8-year-old boy called Peter. And Peter, in a lot of ways, and Evan have a very good relationship. And he looks up to Evan a lot. And I think of Peter as like, Evan sees a reflection of himself. Peter's dad died when he was young. And so he's fatherless. He's in some ways orphaned, though Mia's a wonderful mom. And I think of him as like if Evan had like a loving human proper upbringing with support and care and, you know, raised with EQ, which he was raised with the opposite of it. And so Peter has his own rules of life that he lives by that are distinct from Evan's 10 commandments, right? So instead of never kill an innocent, you know, Mia's always teaching Peter about how to be more open in the world, right? How do you protect so like a child's vulnerability and sweetness while still trying to kind of move them forward to contend with problems. And it's like Evan didn't have any time for that. It was like all that shit, lock it up tight and bury it, you know? So it's a very interesting contrast. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to get to signing. Thanks very much.